All right. I think we're live. Okay, we're live. We're talking about politics. My goodness. How's it going, Joel?
I'm very well, thanks. Melissa, how are you?
Good. We wanted to just chat about all of the madness that's happening this morning because we chatted earlier this week on the podcast, and I just feel like the day before Christmas, I can't believe all this stuff's happening. So we're in the midst of a
It is.
cabinet shuffle that's happening federally right now. Wild.
Yeah, what are you thinking? So it seems as though every morning there's something adding on top of an enormous pile of crazy. And it seems as though they're trying to reorganize,
Yeah.
which is kind of shocking to me. It seems as though that, I mean, they have to, but to what end is this for? And I think that's where obviously you come in.
Yeah.
I wake up in the morning and I check how the news affects the markets, but I'd love to know where it's headed. So
Yeah, well, it's so interesting too, because like this week we were talking about just like what does this all mean in terms of markets, and you were talking a lot about just how the politics impacts government and how that's going to affect monetary policy, fiscal policy, markets. And I think my like big takeaway of what's happening this morning with there's just to like recap what's actually happening for those who aren't aware. The prime minister and several ministers are at Rideau Hall doing a cabinet shuffle right now. So essentially, he's promoted 8 new Liberal MPs that weren't previously officially in cabinet. Some of them were like parliamentary secretaries and in those sorts of roles. So he's promoted 8 new Liberal MPs. He has shuffled 4 existing cabinet ministers. And this is all in the midst of Jagmeet Singh basically saying that he released a letter right before this cabinet shuffle started that he intends to vote non-confidence in the government next year. So that's sort of the context that's happening. But this week, so when Freeland resigned earlier this week, I think that was a pretty significant political development because it sort of was the chips started to fall on the prime minister's inner circle. This announcement, I think, from a political perspective, is a little bit different because I don't actually think it changes anything. Like, I think our podcast that we did earlier this week holds steady because we were already headed in the direction of the government not being able to depend on winning. But now we're kind of into this vibe where it's like the prime minister doesn't look like he's going to resign before January. We might even get into a situation where he's proroguing. But I think of like all the things that matter a lot right now: the dollar, the economy, Trump coming in. And I don't know if anything has changed here because it's all like it's the same leadership. You're definitely shuffling things around. I think if you have a specific policy ask that's outside of parliament that you were hoping to get an answer on, maybe that affects you at the federal level because you're hoping to get an answer. But I don't know if it changes the trajectory at all when it comes to some of that stuff.
so on the pod we talked about the 3 options that you saw for Trudeau specifically.
Yeah.
Is there one of those directions that we're currently traveling down? Is there an option where he can just call a snap election?
Yeah, he always has that option. Like he
Okay.
can walk to the governor general, just like he did this week to say, I want to do a cabinet shuffle. He can walk to the governor general, whose office and residence is at Rideau Hall, where they are right now, and just say, hey, I want you to issue writs of election. Let's go into an election. He has that
Okay.
ability at any time. Election is usually minimum 36 days away. So like in theory, we could have an election 36 days from now. But what seems more likely now, given the fact that Jagmeet Singh has said that has said officially that he's not going to continue to support the Liberals, is we may see him prorogue in the new year to allow for a Liberal leadership race if he resigns. So we were mentioning on the podcast that they go back on January 27th. So before January 27th, he may make the decision of basically stopping Parliament.
Okay.
And then we wouldn't go back to the House of Commons and there would be no opportunity for a no confidence vote. So then the only option left for an election at a timing that's not the prime minister's choosing would be if he called it, or if things drag on to October 27th, which is the date that it's actually scheduled to be on. So that's kind of the way I see it at this point.
Holy moly. So
I
we
know.
either get something quickly or not at all until October.
Yeah, like if he prorogues, especially because there's no like way for any opposition parties to force that sooner than October. They'll eventually have to come back and do a budget, which and if they prorogue, they'll have to open with a throne speech as well, which
Yeah.
both the throne speech and budget are matters of confidence. So it's unlikely that they survive that. So if he prorogues, and he hasn't announced that he is yet, if he prorogues, they're going to want to make sure they have a new liberal leader in place because they know the day they go back, or maybe not the day, but the first couple of days that they go back, they're probably going to be facing a non-confidence motion that
And
they
that's the
fail.
27th.
Yeah, January 27th as of right now. But
And
he'll
that's
probably
cool.
prorogue before that because they don't like the way that, I mean, you don't have to necessarily be in Parliament to prorogue Parliament. Like you can prorogue it when you're not actually sitting, if that makes sense.
So I guess from my perspective, I start to think we want clarity. Markets want clarity. I think our economy is begging for it at this point. Directionally, we have an inkling. Even the most liberal of writers are assuming a conservative win. So whether or not that's true, I mean, who knows? But the market's wanting to price that in. So now you have an unfortunate reality where we either have something change quickly or a delay of put near 10 months. That's bad. So, I mean, you can see it in our currency. It's effectively the confidence that people have in our country, and it's showing face by it trading down 8% on the year versus the USD.
Yeah.
So
can you talk more about that? Because I feel like people don't always connect the way that geopolitics and politics actually affects the economy. Like, of course, people kind of know like the spending and investment and all that kind of stuff. But I actually think that the dollar dynamic is so important. Like we talked a little bit, I was in the States just a couple of weeks ago. It was a 1.43. Like, can you just talk a little bit about why the dollar is doing so bad right now, or why you think the dollar is doing so bad, and what it has to do with politics?
It's multifactorial. So it would be very difficult for me to make an argument to say that it's all government, or the 8% drawdown versus the USD on the year is all government. That's just not true. The strength of the American dollar is also part of that. And if you were to look at other relative currencies, I think it's really important to bring those into view. If you look at the euro, you look at the yen, you look at all of the other currencies versus the US dollar, they are also struggling on a very similar level. So it is government stability. It is the view that the Canadian economy is not as strong as the American. However, it also is the fact that we are cutting rates at a much quicker pace than the United States is. 2 days ago, we had the largest volatility spike in the VIX specifically since 2018, and that was after Jerome Powell's speech, which the Fed doesn't reconvene until February, I don't believe. So he came out and he was quite hawkish meaning that they're going to maintain rates at a higher rate than previously believed. They only did a 25% basis or a 25 basis points cut. And of that,
we did 50 basis points last week or whatever, right?
Yeah. So now they're hovering between, I think, 425 and 450, and we're significantly below that. And our dot plot showing that we're going to continue to cut into next year. Inflation hasn't been completely beat in the United States, and in Canada, we have an unfortunate issue where we have to maintain a mortgage market that is we don't have 20-year mortgages like America does and 30-year mortgages. Unfortunately, we have renewables. We have people on variable. We have people that are renewing their mortgages and having to do so going from 1.5 to 2% mortgages into what's much closer to 4.5, 5, depending on the level of debt that you're taking on. And that is
Kate, sorry to pause you. And isn't there a big difference too? Because in Canada, we can't United States, people who live in the United States and have mortgages write off the interest that they pay on mortgages as well. We don't do that in
Yeah,
Canada,
but
right?
without getting too deep into that, like the tax side of it, yes, that
Yeah.
is partially true in America. In Canada, we don't have that luxury unless you're an investor and you hold it in corporations and you have the ability to write off those sorts of interest. But broadly speaking, for the large majority of Canadians, they don't have that luxury. They don't have that ability.
Yeah.
So it is our mortgage market and our real estate market is much more important to our economy than it is in the United States. And as a
Yes.
result of that, the Bank of Canada, who will never say this because their mandate again is employment and inflation. They are never going to say we're going to support the housing market here, but you have to think that that's on the back of their minds. They have to take that into consideration. So,
Yeah.
with all of that being said, we have a very similar issue to America in that inflation is not beat. It's starting to rear its head again. In 2025, it's very likely that it becomes an issue very similar to, well, and probably not to the same extent as it was in 2022, but it's going to rear its head. It's going to be an issue that is perking back up. During 2024 and the back half of 2023, we felt like we had conviction on direction of where inflation was going. And it seems as though it's now reversed the other way. However, our Bank of Canada is still cutting. So that impacts the Canadian dollar versus the US dollar. And that is a big portion as to why it has weakened. So you have the American USD wrecking ball, which is it continues to appreciate. When people are concerned about anything, they flock to US dollars. So
Yeah.
that drives up the price versus other currencies. You then have to consider the fact that they are maintaining a higher rate of free money versus
What
the
does that
Canadian
mean? What
dollar.
does that mean? Tell me. I love like
So
the finance stuff, but I don't know.
risk-free money is basically treasury bills or GICs or whatever you want to refer to as, but basically government bonds. In the United States, the risk-free rate is higher than it is in Canada. And if they maintain that as being higher, the dollar is going to be more attractive. For people that want, say, they got $100,000 and they want to receive a high rate of return for effectively doing nothing with their money, they would likely want to put it in American bonds or buy American debt or because they would benefit from that more so than if you were to buy Canadian debt because we don't pay the same amount of interest. So these are all factors that go into why the Canadian dollar has weakened versus the US dollar. And then you compound that and add on top of that a government that is in flux. And it just starts to kind of compound. And that's why we've seen such a major drop. And I'm not sure of this, but if we were to get a snap election, I think that would be very healthy for Canada.
In Canada.
Yes. And I think that you would likely see a strengthening Canadian dollar because of it. And it's just because markets like certainty. They like things to be cleared up. And investors, people that are wanting to put money to work in Canada, will view whichever government wins. Who knows who wins? They'll view stability as being opportunity.
So it's not necessarily like, I mean, this would probably be an oversimplification, but if I'm hearing you correctly, on the political side and how it's impacting the markets, it's not even necessarily just that the policies are objectively good or bad for business, but that those policies are predictable from a timing and nature standpoint. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm very much in the camp that I don't think politicians deserve as much credit as they get for ups and downs in the economy. So it's very much investors and people that participate in the economy on the private and public sector side want to see stability. They want to see some sort of forward path that's clear. Whether or not they agree with it is not even that as important as there being clarity. So I think that if Justin Trudeau was to care about the country, he would call an election just because he is bringing stability back. Whether he wins or doesn't win doesn't matter. So I'm hopeful that actually is a result. Our market would like it. if he called it earlier instead of waiting until October.
Yeah.
So I'm very interested to see what he ends up doing. I just don't see how going through this summer is going to somehow benefit his current bid for the position. I mean, he's been in there a long time. It's hard to keep going.
It's so interesting, like, so not to bring that side of it back to the political aspect of it. It's so interesting that you say that, because the new information that we got today was essentially, okay, so we have the NDP who's saying they're not going to be willing to hold the government up anymore, which, I mean, even though we all sort of assumed that would be the case at some point in the new year, we now have the leader saying that that is in fact what they intend to do. So we sort of know that if given the opportunity they go back on January 27th, March, April, if given the opportunity, they're going to take it. So that's really sending a signal to the market that the Liberals are on borrowed time if they don't prorogue. And what I'm hearing from what you're saying too is like, we don't even, so let's say that the Liberals manage to survive. Let's say Justin Trudeau steps down, there's a new Liberal leader, there's in some way they manage to survive through the summer and to the legislated October 20th fixed election date later next year. We're still not really solving the problem of markets, because we talked a little bit about the podcast as well. We don't exactly even know what Poilievre is going to do with his policies, right? So it's uncertainty on timing of election and uncertainty on what that's going to bring. I just thought that was so interesting when we chatted about that on the podcast.
That in of itself is the biggest problem, because we have Pierre, who has run a great opposition campaign, essentially. However, he's been purposely vague.
Yeah.
And he's going to continue to be, because there's no benefit, as you had made very clear. And that is bad for markets. That is bad for Canada. We need clarity. Businesses want to know when and if Pierre wins, what are the Conservatives going to bring to the table? And we don't know. And there's no benefit for him to do so.
Yeah. Like he's not in charge of the economy yet. He's in charge of his own political party. And so I was thinking about this morning too, like all these different responsibilities that all of these politicians have. So when he is, or if he is prime minister, he'll be responsible for making decisions that are in the best interest of the market, et cetera. But he's not in that role right now. That's Pierre Poilievre. But the prime minister is. And so it is interesting to look at, like, if we want to get really nerdy in terms of timing, like there is technically a world within which the election doesn't happen on October 20th, 2025, because you can extend in times of emergency and all these different things. Again, I'm not suggesting that is going to happen, but you have all these legislative, actually, I think there's a literal less than 1% chance that would happen. But you have all these tools as the prime minister in a parliamentary democracy to make all these decisions. And I was thinking about the dichotomy between like what you're allowed to do and what the law is and what the leadership thing to do is, right? And so we get caught between, and then somewhere in there, like what the proper strategy is. And it's interesting because just, the last major cabinet shuffle that Justin Trudeau did, I'm going way back, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Pierre Poilievre, too many Pierres. The last major cabinet shuffle that we saw in Canada was in the summer of 2023. So it's interesting, like, what is the prime minister going to do from a strategic perspective and a political perspective, and what should he do, right? And I think like the struggle that's going to start to damage him politically is that there's all these shoulds that even just the average person who doesn't necessarily even pay that much attention to politics is now coming alive to. And so whereas you don't really have people necessarily paying attention to all of this stuff,
now
it's something everybody. Yeah, like tell me a bit, because you live in Edmonton, I live in Calgary. I do have a pretty diverse political circle, but it's probably a little bit more conservative than not. Edmonton is a little bit more left of center tell me what you're just hearing anecdotally from people who like maybe 6 to 12 months ago would have like never even thought about voting conservative, but maybe are considering it now, or another party.
I mean, I consider my friend and client and just even professional circle to be very diverse from a party affiliation perspective. So shockingly, it's definitely, the tune has changed so starkly against the Liberal side, even for an Alberta, which would almost certainly be right of center from a population perspective.
Yeah.
Those that support the Liberal leadership for the last 8-10 years are a little bit disappointed, I think, in the last 6 or 9 months. And I think that Justin Trudeau should probably start to think about legacy at this point. What is that going to be? And does it make sense for him to hold on? And will that fracture further that legacy of his? Because I do believe that a lot of Liberals are very happy with his the results that he's had over the last 8 or 10 years. And the longer he holds on, it's likely that that reputation ends up perhaps not being the same and getting quite a bit worse. So, I mean, if I'm him sitting in his shoes, I would be calling it quickly, just because it's better for the country that he has run, and better for, I mean, it's where he's from. His last name is arguably the most famous in our country's history. He should likely take that into consideration. So
I agree with you. And I think that it's like, it doesn't matter if you're a Justin Trudeau fan, a Liberal voter, a conservative voter. I think in the type of democracy that we have, and in the type of government that we have, it's so rare to see like these graceful exits. Almost like it's almost like it always has to come crashing down in order for something to change, which I think is a shame, because I think that regardless of how you feel about the current government, like I think that after governing for, they will, next year will be 10 years. You don't necessarily want the change in chapter to be like so disappointing almost, like, and you don't like, you don't want it to be remembered as the prime minister that just wouldn't quit, or the leader that wouldn't allow for sort of like the next step in the party to happen. And I think I just want to make one more point about that in particular. We talk a lot about like, I'm in the business of sort of looking at facts and then trying to interpret what those facts actually mean in terms of what might happen, and how that political risk is factored into business risk. So there's this sort of anecdotal perception of he should step down or he should do this. And maybe that's coming from, people who are saying that is coming from a combination of personal preference and also strategy. But when we look at just the raw numbers of how Trudeau is doing at this point, his approval rating as leader is 28%. It's the lowest since the SNC-Lavalin scandal. And the party is polling lower than he is. So the party is polling at 20%, more than 20 points behind the Conservatives that are polling at and above 40%. So in a weird way, like his brand is still stronger than the Liberal brand right now, which is, to me, fascinating, because the Liberal brand in Canadian politics has historically been one of the strongest, most resilient brands in politics, like most trusted. So it's very interesting to see. Yes, there are undoubtedly leadership issues, but there's also, I think, perception issues with the Liberals too, that is causing people to say, hey, like maybe I'm going to vote differently this time, or think twice about who I'm voting for.
Which is shocking. And I will say, and this is anecdotally, of my professional group, those that have historically supported the Liberal Party, they've disclosed to me that they're not even going to vote in the next election.
Oh no, I hope people vote. Even if you go into the poll and just cross it out and say, just exercise your vote. Like, just go to the polling booth and say, I don't like any of these options, cross it out, spoil your ballot, but please vote. Please vote.
I fully support that. But the thing, that is a a change in sentiment towards the party,
Yeah.
not the person,
Yeah.
or the leader, and that is too bad for if you're a liberal supporter. In these people's case, they've wronged them. So in some way or another, the party has done them wrong. And that, like you had mentioned, that it's an incredible brand. If you really are being, I don't know if I'm trying to be bipartisan or impartial, like that it is a great brand. I mean, the Conservatives have had a struggle to reunite and to rebuild, and the Liberals have long been very steady. And I think that's starting to really disintegrate, sadly. And just anecdotally in Alberta, I would love to hear more about people that live in Southern Ontario and hear kind of at the epicenter of this all, you know?
Yeah, I'm curious as well, because I mean, the chances that we see the government dissolve before January 27th or an election before then are like quite small, I think, or January 20th rather, for when President-elect Trump is inaugurated. But I'm very curious to see too how like our markets and economies are so connected in so many ways, and things that happen in the US affect Canada so much.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very curious to see whether the response from the Canadian electorate from a political perspective is sort of against what's going to happen in the United States on the 20th, or if people start to see that and become emboldened, and that even strengthens the Conservative lead. I'm very curious to see how that will respond.
I don't know. That is a whole nother can of worms. You have you have an incoming president that is calling us a state.
Yeah.
So,
gosh, that was the governor, Justin Trudeau. While I laughed, is really, a little scary.
It's really like it. I don't even know how to think about it. The proper decorum in politics has seemed to erode quite significantly over the last 8 to 12 years, and this is just another example of that, and probably the most egregious of examples, at least in terms of the Canadian-US relationship. There's obviously zero respect. And I mean, I don't generally think it's healthy to take Donald Trump's tweets or posts as gospel, because you never know what he's acting on. You never know what he's just whether he's just trying to rile up his base or whatever he's doing. You never fully can view it as being like, this is going to be instituted. However, it does matter. And I'm not sure what the solution is going to be. That seems very complicated. And the incoming Canadian Prime Minister and leadership group needs to rebuild that respect and needs to earn it. Because, and I'm not here to give advice on how to do that, by the way. I don't know. This seems like a very, very, very difficult thing to do.
Well, and it's interesting to say as well. So even if there's a change in government and we have a Pierre Poilievre prime minister, which is what it's looking more and more what it's going to look like, I don't think it's fair to assume that Trump is just going to be like, oh, another conservative in the prime minister's chair in Canada. Like Poilievre will have to stand up to and be strategic with how he deals with Trump too. So I don't want to give anybody who's listening the illusion that Trudeau is the problem, and from that perspective, all the problems are just going to go away. I think it just is maybe it's a more worthy rival because there's not that history of disrespect or perception of disrespect. I don't know. I mean, Donald Trump is not a predictable human being, and with a new prime minister, you don't know what's going to happen. But I think that's what people can hope for. And the reason why that is important to the economy and to markets is we talked a little bit on the podcast earlier this week of what these tariffs mean and what they're going to apply to. And so I think that somebody who is able to have trust and negotiate, that doesn't mean that I think we really need to differentiate between full supporter of the new administration and fully behind everything that administration is doing and acting in Canada's strategic best interests. And just to add another thing in here. So I don't even know if we talked about this in the podcast this week, but in June, Canada is hosting the G7 in Kananaskis. So like we're going to have heads of state and delegations from the G7 in Canada. I personally, whether that's a government that's led by a new liberal leader, I personally would like to have an election before then and have somebody sitting at the table that can like credibly have conversations and know they're going to be in that seat for more than just a few months. Like, I think that matters personally.
Yeah. And yeah, here's hoping that we get an election, and whoever the country chooses, great. But we need it.
Yeah.
At this point, it is. I mean, you can never call a bottom in markets. It's impossible. You're catching falling knives. I don't recommend it at all. To say that this is as bad as it gets, I don't believe that that's true if he holds on. So
you think okay? So yeah. Talk to me
about
that a bit. Like, can you, so I am not as into, like, I definitely pay attention to the economy, and I think probably am more educated than most on what's going on, but I don't always know what that's going to translate to. Like, I was telling you, I was worried that there was going to, like, I'm making decisions in my own business and my own life in preparation for a recession, but you were saying like, maybe there's optimism ahead or not. Like talk a bit about like what you think the difference is there.
Yeah, I guess for those that are will listen or watch this, the markets price things 9 to 12 months out, depending on the multiple and the sector. Sometimes 18 months, if it's let's call it something that has more momentum attached to it. That is all to say that I view, and I think the market saw that Canada was in a recession last year. Whether you believe that to be true or not, based on like some arbitrary GDP number, our stock market has done very well this year. It's up 17-ish%, I believe, at this current time. That isn't bad relative to all the other countries, with the exception of a few like Argentina, etc. Yet still drastically trailing the United States.
Yeah.
So the market believed that we were on our way out of that recession, that inflation was normalizing, and that we were going to be able to guide a path forward. However, over the last 3 weeks, we've seen the TSX pull back 4 or 5% from its more recent 52-week high. And that is all in the backs of a government influx.
And what do you mean by that, government influx? Like,
we
just
don't
the
know
changes
anything.
in the states? Oh, like the uncertainty. Yeah.
The uncertainty has returned, which means that their investors think that over the next 9 to 12 months, we are going to be in a worse position than they believed 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago.
That is fascinating.
You reprice based on perception of 9 to 12 months out. And right now, I think it's still expected that inflation is going to be between 2 to 3%. We're going to be fine.
Yeah.
The fact that we still have so many bullets in our monetary gun, that is still viewed as power. Because when you go and you take a look at the European economy, you look at the Chinese economy, and you look at their current 10-year yield, it is still very attractive to be invested in Canada relative to the rest of the world. Currencies, markets are all relative based.
Yeah. That's a really important point, especially on GDP when we talk about it. Like, that's a very important point, especially politically.
I mean, from if you were a global allocator and you were to start your investing, the United States is like something like 65% of the total market cap of the world. That is unbelievable, given the fact that they have like 350 million people that live there, and the globe has 8 billion.
Yeah.
They are a tiny fraction of the population and the lion's share of market cap.
And productivity is what that translates to as well, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Canada also is kind of a beast relative to population on a global scale. So Canada is still, if you're a Canadian watching this, we're always comparing ourselves to our neighbor. And it's really difficult to do that because they are the big bad America. And America has left everyone in the dust. In 2016, it was viewed that China was it was going to be some form of competitor to America, that their market cap was going to be larger, that their GDP output was going to continue to grow at 6, 7, 8% annualized. And since 2016, their market has cratered. They didn't do well coming out of COVID relative to America and the G7.
Yeah.
And their currency and their markets have priced that in. And you see their monetary policy, and they're cutting rates like crazy right now because, well, their economy is not starting. They have a housing crisis. There's concerns there. So in Canada, obviously, we immediately, we're always looking at our CAD USD. We're always looking at, oh my goodness, the TSX is trailing the S&P for the 7th out of the last 8 years. Or I don't know if that's absolutely true, but we have significantly lagged the S&P. And if you're a global allocator, you look at Canada's 40 million population, tiny little $3 trillion market cap of their stock market, and view it as being kind of a nothing burger.
Yeah.
However, we're pretty important, and we're still doing quite well. And there's still a lot of opportunity here. We have arguably one of the greatest land masses in the world. We have the best trading partner on the planet. And yet we seem to be stuck in the mud a little bit. And if we could get some policy updates, if we can get some changes in government, whether it be just leadership and some clarity, holy moly, would that go a long way. And I mean, this is, again, who am I to give policy advice to anybody? I think what we want to do is maybe copy what's worked, and you don't have to look far.
Okay, so I hear the government talking a lot about like strongest GDP growth in the G7, et cetera. So, and people, I think anecdotally,
easy to compound small numbers, by the way.
It's always like, okay, so we have to always be honest intellectually about numbers. Like GDP growth per capita percentage is relative to how fast you were growing. So it's not like an objective measure across economies. It's okay.
Because we were in a recession last year.
Exactly. Right. So I think that's really important to note as well. And as well, add on top of the fact that you're comparing to the US and their significantly stronger economy. It's a lot different. When it comes to so there's kind of like there's a few different aspects to the money and politics part of this. So there's our fiscal policy, which has to do with how much debt our government is in and how strong the outlook looks for our sort of our country in Canada, our budgetary balance. There's monetary policy, which has to do with, the Bank of Canada is independent. They set the overnight rate, which translates to interest rates, which has an impact on borrowing and yields on government bonds, as well as an inverse relationship to some of that stuff. That has to do with inflation in many ways, in terms of like controlling the money supply to grow between 1% and 3%, which is that's what the government of the governor of the Bank of Canada and their team is trying to do. The government is trying to introduce policies and legislation and allocate spending in such a way that the economy can thrive. What do markets say about those two aspects when they look at a country like Canada? Like, do markets respond to fiscal policy in terms of the likelihood of economic growth, or like how are markets looking at that? Like, Bank of Canada is not political in the sense it's not partisan. I mean, it's political, but it's not partisan. It's not a decision that's made by the government. But fiscal policy is government within the government's role. How are markets responding to? How do markets respond to that? I mean, other than the certainty aspect, like what kinds of things do markets like to see from government?
So again, this is if I'm being impartial here, I don't want to use Canada as an example here. A better, more important example would be Japan. So recently, I mean, in Japan, they've had some serious government volatility. They've had an assassination.
Yeah.
But they also had a pretty close to three decades of no market cap appreciation. So like their market was not appreciating from a return perspective. They had that massive boom, 80s, 90s, where in many worlds, a lot of people believed that Japan was going to overtake the United States from an economic perspective. Obviously, that didn't play out. However, over the last 3 or 4 years, Japan has, and for the longest time, maintained a 0% interest rate policy. That was their way of stimulating, trying to see some form of inflationary appreciation. They have not seen any whatsoever. They were flat forever. Many people might view having 0% inflation as a good thing, but the Bank of Canada has that mandate of seeing CPI growth of like 2 to 3%. They want to see full employment. That is their mandate, period. End of story. They don't care about the stock market, technically. Obviously, I do, but the Bank of Canada does not. So when you look at Japan, they've recently been able to actually get off the floor and start to increase rates. So right now, when you borrow money in Japan, you actually have to pay a rate now. Like
that's so wild, like negative interest rates, essentially.
In Europe, they had it. And now they've now started to see an economy that is growing again.
Because let's just stop right here for to explain that to folks who don't understand. Because what Japan is trying to do in that scenario is encourage people to spend money, essentially.
Yeah. So when you lower rates, you're trying to increase the elasticity of money. You want to see people buy more stuff so that the people that were selling you that stuff can go and buy more stuff. That is how GDP expansion happens without adding more money to the economy
and wealth creation. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. That's how wealth creation exists. So in Japan, they had that dark 3 decades or 2.5 decades, and the market itself also did so poor. They've now been able to start to increase their interest rate policy, and that sent shockwaves through. But that also signaled to the world that things were changing. They've also changed their immigration policy. They are now letting people move there, get jobs there. They're taking a few pages from the US and implementing them to start to reinvigorate their economy. And as a result, their stock market broke out to new all-time highs in that time period. They've started to see people reinvest in the currency, start to reinvest in the country. And that is largely on the back of tax policy, immigration policy changes. So when you start to say, how do markets react to governments and what they do, it's the perception of what works and what doesn't work. And then those governments actually implementing those things. So now, whether or not you believe tax cuts, corporate tax cuts, to being positive or good or negative for the population, the market has voted that it is good for stock prices. So when you start to kind of unpeel or whatever that orange, that onion, whatever, if you are a incoming government and want to see an economy that thrives, the policy that you implement likely needs to be close to that of a policy that has worked, or at least the market believes to work, right? So the market has voted that the current policy that we're running is not as beneficial to the or to the economies of it's not as beneficial as the United States policy has been. And whether you call that a corporate tax rate of 28% and view that as being better or good, whether you believe a government mandated capital system is better than a private sector, that you can have those opinions, but the market currently believes the other one's better.
Yes. Sorry, finish your thought.
So markets they don't care about your feelings at all. They just want to see number go up. That's it. That is the goal, period. End of story. And the perception of how the policy that's in place is going to impact stock prices and bond prices and business performance is they do not care. Markets do not care. They want to see that number appreciate. So if an incoming government wants to see appreciation of their market and to see business expand and to be more profitable, and if you view that as being beneficial to the population of the country, well, then it's, to me, fairly obvious what you start to implement. But again, I'm not a politician. I am by no means an economist. That's just me, someone who's watched markets for well over a decade. That's how I see it.
Okay, so I have so much to say about that. I'm like feverishly taking notes because I think that you've said a lot there. I have actually always believed from an ideological perspective, and I hope that we can have more people that are on board with this because I think it will help with just unity and better tone in politics. I actually believe that every single leader of every single political party is genuinely, they are trying to do their best to create the best version of Canada. I don't actually think that's in dispute in Canada. I think that like we are very lucky to live in a democracy that we live in where we have freedom and the ability to disagree without it being sort of existential. But it's always the how. It's always, okay, what does that look like to you? And how are we going to put in policies to get there? And I think when it comes to at least all of the major political parties, I actually think that you can make an argument that, let's just even look at the Liberals and the Conservatives, that both of those political parties think that the policies that they are putting forward are going to best contribute to productivity and GDP growth. Mm-hmm. But the how that you go about that is different, right? Because nothing is ever sort of extreme. In Canada, we have a public education system, public healthcare system, which I think we should be very proud of. So it's not a pure capitalist calculation of what it means to live the good life in Canada and to create those conditions. And so it's always this balancing act with government and policy choices of, if we have, total social safety net and total state sort of not control, but sort of responsibility for well-being, and then total market control for well-being on the other side. I think in Canada, it works best when you have a balance between the two, where you're sort of maximizing like what is the best role that each of those entities can play in that context. And so what I'm hearing from you is that from a pure economic growth perspective, there are things that governments can do to help that market side of things, which actually then in turn, in the fiscal update earlier this week, part of why we're seeing deficits is lower revenue from taxes because of the sort of softening of corporate activity. That's not to say that governments should be making decisions only to benefit corporations. Of course, I don't mean that, but we must as well consider when we have maybe shifted policy in such a way where we're sort of taking for granted some of what we get on the other side without considering the source of how we can maintain that on the other side.
Yeah. And I think that one of the beauties of the democratic process is that you end up getting a great push and pull from both sides, where you have one side that believes a certain deliverable is expected, and then you have another that is perhaps more market based. So let's call that liberal conservative. If you were to view the United States as, we'll call it a case study, if you were to run the gambit and have the Republicans own all three levels of government in America for 20 years, I don't think I'd want to see that.
Yeah, exactly.
And the result of that, because who knows who's left out as a result. And then on the same end, you don't want to see 20 years of Democrats either, because there is a lot of power and there being checks and balances. And it is markets actually love when you have a government that's perhaps in lock, and that's because they've set their mandate in place, and then no new policy can be thrown in to disrupt that clarity. So
and that disrupts innovation and growth and all those things too, right? The extreme can happen on both sides. Yeah.
There's a lot. I'm not sure our term limits, or I shouldn't say term limits. I'm not sure that the way in which our system runs is the most efficient. I don't know. Is the American electoral system better? I don't know that either. I don't actually know what has the best result for population. I'm quite happy with Canada as a Canadian citizen. The idea of America or Canada becoming a 51st state is unacceptable to me.
No, exactly.
The whole point of, I guess, what I'm trying to say is that right now the market believes that there's a certain type of mandate that works, and if Canada wants to see a benefit from a market perspective, we need to consider that. And right now we're running that deficit. I think that one of the biggest issues that we currently have is that our country is strapped from a debt perspective, not at the federal level, but at the consumer
household
level.
Yep, it's some of the
Households
highest.
are hurting. Our government isn't. It's actually loaded relative to the G7. So on a debt to GDP ratio, Canada is doing terrific. We're actually running the smallest deficit relative to our G7 nations. If you look at the deficit that America is running, if Canadian conservatives were to apply that, they would puke. They'd be they'd be like, "Oh, I'm a fiscal conservative." I'm telling you right now, if you saw the deficit that America was running and then applied that number on a GDP level, it'd be significantly higher than the one that we're running.
I'll add one nuance to what you're saying from a political perspective. I think that we always do have to consider in Canada what such a large percentage of our GDP growth is accounted for home inflation and rising. And so, right. And so if you're not in that market, then it's a very I know you got to go in a couple of minutes, so we'll wrap this up. But I can't remember who was talking about it. So I don't want to steal it, but they were basically talking about like the new class divide is home ownership, because if you're not in that market like that in Canada, because that is just like where so much of the GDP growth is coming from. So even though we are doing well relative on a large scale, to your point on the individual sort of Canadian level, that's a macro number and a macro measure that is, I think, not equally applicable across Canadians.
It's not fair,
right?
To use. And it is a bad blanket measure to really dive into the success of each individual. It just doesn't work. Yeah. So you're absolutely, I totally agree with you. And that's a good point to make. So I just would like to, I don't want everyone to feel as though Canada is in these dire straits. I think relative to the rest of the world, we're still doing terrific. It's just, it seems as though we need some help, and it would be really good to see government. Yeah, it'd be really great to see government start to sort itself out.
I agree. Okay, well, this was so fun. I know you've got to run, and I mean, we could sit here and talk all day about this stuff, but thanks for chatting. I love connecting how politics is affecting the markets and people's lives, and it's always a pleasure. So thanks for doing this, and hopefully you have a good Friday and happy holiday, and we'll do this again soon.
Absolutely. Same to you. We'll definitely chat soon.
Bye.